Hi everyone, today I'm doing a sew along for my new Know Me pattern 2109. It is a vest, barrel leg jean combo. We'll be sewing up both view A and view B in this video. So if you're ready to make this fun pattern, keep watching. For view A, you want to go ahead and start cutting out your pattern pieces. You should have 5 in total. You want to also make sure you mark your notches. You cut out your lining pieces as well as the pieces you need in interfacing. Once you have all those cut out, we can get started. We're going to start by grabbing our 2 front pieces and pinning the front interfacing on the wrong side and ironing that in place. The next thing we're going to do is stay stitch our front and back pieces so they do not stretch as we work with this vest. Be sure to do it in the direction that the instructions tell you to do it in. Next, we're going to prepare our patches by stitching 2 rows of stitching to help us ease in these curves. And once you have them eased, you can go ahead and press them and then place them on the right side of your front pieces, pin in place, and sew down using 2 rows of top stitching. Once you've done this to your front, you're going to use the exact same method to do the back piece. Once that's all sewn up, you're going to attach the front and the back, right sides facing at the shoulder seams, and sew those down. And once that's sewn, we're going to do the same thing with the lining, putting fronts and backs right sides facing, sewing at the shoulder seam, giving it a good press, and then now we're going to pin the right side of the lining to the right side of the vest, almost all the way around, but we want to make sure that we keep the sides of the fronts and backs open, but sewing everything else closed at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once that is done, we're going to trim our edges and also cut into our curves so it turns and presses nicely. And once we're finished with that, we're going to turn the vest right side out, leaving those sides open. Once you have it all the way turned out, I definitely recommend using a point turner and going over to the iron to press your edges to have them be more crisp. Once that's done, we're going to try and understitch our lining down to the seam allowance as far as we can in our machine. Take your time with this because you want to make sure you're only getting the lining and seam allowance as you do this. But once that's done, you're going to take it back over to the table and stitch the sides together, right sides facing, while also going 1 inch above into the lining and 1 inch below into the lining as well. So once you pin that in place, you're going to just sew that down at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And you want to make sure that everything is flat and that you're only sewing the layers you're supposed to be sewing as you close the side seams. And once that's done, you'll want to slip stitch the lining closed, but then now you can use the buttonhole placement to mark your buttonholes. Sew those with whatever machine that you use. I use a Singer Heavy Duty 4452, and then use those buttonholes to mark your button placement. And once you have your button placement, you can go ahead and sew your buttons down. Here is the finished vest in all of its glory. I love the lining, I love the buttons, and the patches on the front and back are so cool. And it's such an easy and fun project to knock out in a day or two. Moving on to view B, you want to make sure that you cut out all of your pattern pieces as well as notch where you are supposed to. Cut out your pocket lining as well as any pieces that need interfacing. Once that's complete, you should have 12 pattern pieces and we can get started. So the first thing you want to do is interface all the pieces that need interfacing. Go ahead and take them over to your iron and interface according to the instructions on your interfacing. Once that's done, we're going to move on to the front and mark our front dart on the wrong side of both front pieces and then pin them in place and go to our sewing machine and sew them down. You also want to make sure that you leave a long thread tail at the end so you can tie off your dart instead of backstitching at that place. This will reduce the bulk within the dart point. After that's done, we're going to reinforce our pocket edge like the instructions suggest, using our markings on our pattern pieces and then going over to our sewing machine and sewing on that corner line. Once that's done, we're going to take our pocket lining and face it right sides to right sides with our front piece, pin it in place, and sew it down at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you iron that and it's complete, you'll want to understitch your pocket lining and then turn it right sides up and top stitch down at 1/4 of an inch. After that, we're going to finish the pocket bag by attaching the side, front, and pocket to the pocket facing. You'll want to match your dots and notches, pin in place, and sew it down at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I also went ahead and serged the raw edges of the pocket bag as well. Next, you'll want to pin the pocket opening in place so you can stay stitch the side and the top to make sure it stays in place as you are sewing. And I like to do this with the longest stitch length on my sewing machine. Then you'll grab your front yoke, go ahead and place it right sides facing, matching your notches, pinning it in place, and then sewing it at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I serged the finished edge and then top stitched the front yoke at 1/4 of an inch. And once that's done, you want to go ahead and do that to your other front piece. And then once you have your two front pieces complete, you'll place them on top of each other, right sides facing, mark your large dot, pin it in place, and then sew from your large dot to your notch at 5/8 of an inch. From there, you're going to turn in the right front opening along that fold line and then give it a good press. Once that's pressed, you're going to place the closed zipper facing up under the right front edge, close to the zipper teeth, and use the zipper foot to base close to the pressed edge. After that, we're going to prepare our right fly by taking our two pieces, putting them right sides together, and sewing along the long unnotched edge. Once I completed this, I went ahead and serged that edge as well, and then you're going to place the right fly over the zipper on the inside of the pant, pin in place, and stitch close to the pressed edge of the front through all layers. Once you have that completed, you'll want to take your left fly facing, serge the outer edge, pin it to the left front opening, and sew that in place at 5/8 of an inch down to the large dot. From there, I clipped my project closed and attached the remaining zipper to just the left fly facing. Take it over to your sewing machine and sew it in place. Then you'll want to take your front pattern piece and use it as a guide to draw out the stitching line for your fly. Making sure the left fly facing is out of your way, go over to your machine and sew that stitching line. Once that's done, you're going to hand tack or hand sew the fly and facing together at the lower edge. Moving on to the back, we're going to work on the pockets. You'll want to press them towards the back by 1/4 inch and then turn it right side up and fold right side to right side along the fold line. Give that a press and then take it over to your sewing machine and sew all the way around at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once that's complete, I went ahead and serged my raw edges and then started to flip the pockets right side out, gave it all a good press, and then top stitch the back pocket. Then you'll want to grab your back pieces using your pattern piece to mark where your pockets are placed, pin them in place, and then you want to sew them down close to the edge and then 1/4 inch from that sewing line. And just like the front, we're going to grab our back yoke, pin it in place right sides to right side, serge and press, and then top stitch our back yokes down. Moving right along, we're going to attach the inner legs of our front and back pieces together at our notches, pin them in place, and sew down at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once I completed that, I also serged it, and then you're going to finish the back seam by placing your back pieces right sides facing, pinning them in place at your notches, and sewing at 5/8 of an inch until you get to that large dot on the front. And once that's completed and serged, we're going to attach our side seams by doing the same thing, pinning at our notches, going over to our sewing machine, and sewing that down at 5/8 of an inch. Putting the pants aside for now, we're going to work on our belt loop by taking our carrier piece, pressing it in half, and then using that press line to fold it into fourths and then in half on itself. And once you've done that and given it a good press, you can go ahead and cut out your belt loops. and then you'll use your yoke pattern pieces belt loop guide to place your belt loops. I like to use clips and then stay stitch them down. Once that's complete, we can go ahead and work on our waistband, combining our two interface pieces together and then clipping them at the top of the waistband, sewing that in place at just the top at 5/8 of an inch. Giving that a good press, trimming down our seams, and then taking our waistband facing and pinning that to our waistband as well, sewing just the top all the way around at 5/8 of an inch. When that's completed, you'll want to understitch your seam allowance to the facing and then also press in the waistband facing by 1/2 inch. And once that's completed, you can go ahead and close your waistband at the edges. Then we're going to turn our waistband right sides out, give it a good press, making sure to line up our folded edge of the facing with the stitch line that we just created. We're going to give that a press and then use our pin to pin on the outside of the pant, making sure to pin the facing directly where we want it to land so we can then go and stitch in the ditch all the way around. This technique of stitching in the ditch just means that you need to take your time. I'm keeping this in real time. This is how slow I go when stitching in the ditch, just to make sure I am stitching in the actual ditch and not on top of the seam or below the seam. Take your time, breathe, and take as many breaks as you need. And we're in the home stretch now as we prepare our belt loops to be completed. We'll just fold them at the top and then pin them at the top of our waistband and stitch each belt loop to the waistband. And then we're going to hem our pant by folding first 1/4 inch and then folding again by 1 inch, giving it a press and taking it over to our sewing machine and sewing it all in place. Then I'm going to use the buttonhole guide to mark where my buttonhole should go on my pant. Machine stitch a buttonhole, and once I've opened the buttonhole, use it to mark my button placement, grab my button, and machine stitch that button onto my pant. And then from there, you have a completed pant. Here's the finished project. I love the silhouette of these pants. I used a 7-ounce denim, so it's light but also still keeps its shape. But this is such a fun pairing to the vest of this pattern. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. You can find my new Know Me pattern in stores and online. And if you happen to make it, please let me know by tagging me on Instagram at happilydressed. Thank you so much for watching.